Thank you for inviting me here. And there's a lot of folks to thank. You know, this has been kind of a whirlwind experience here. I've been here 2 days now, and I want to thank Judd and Wanda May and Scott Lane, and I could go on and on with everybody, but you know, for putting all this stuff together, because it's been very well organized. And I've learned probably two really important things since I've been here. Number one is that this is a great community. In fact, my trip has been perfect. The weather's been perfect. The food's been perfect. You know, the events that you pull together have been perfect. In fact, it's been so good, I kind of feel like I'm doomed to just completely bomb the presentation, just to have a kind of a more normal experience, you know. So hopefully I won't, but anyway, it's been, you know, this is a great, great community. And so if you live here, like I guess most of you do, you should consider yourself extremely fortunate. And the other thing I've learned is that in Tryon, people have opinions. Did you know that? They do, you know. This is, and there's great opinions, but you know, it makes my job a lot easier when we have these little meetings and I hear people talk and they think things and they have ideas and they share them. They're not shy about sharing their ideas. So that's great for me. So anyway, so as you probably guessed or already knew, so here's what I'm going to go over. I'm going to very briefly just remind you. I think you all know why downtown is so important, but I want to remind you why. I want to just review briefly some of the achievements that TDDA has you know, achieved. Can I say achievements? Things you've attained over the years. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about best practices, that is in downtown revitalization, and give you some examples of other communities, what they've been doing. But I want to spend most of the time on just kind of my preliminary ideas. And I'll have all sorts of caveats when I get to that point, given that this is all based on essentially 2 days of kind of fact-finding and meeting with people and walking around your downtown and so forth. But that's what we're going to cover. So just to remind you, why is it the downtown's so important? Well, you know, this is where so much of your town's history occurred. In fact, you know, the railroad was a big part of your history, and so the town started right here. And you do have such a rich history. It's where all your cultural things are, you know, whether it's museums, you know, art centers, government, library, all those kind of things. It is clearly your cultural center. It's also owned by everyone, and this isn't just your downtown. This is in any community. I find if I'm doing a plan, I do all types of city planning. If I'm doing a plan in some community for let's say the northeast sector of the community, when I have meetings like this, the folks that show up are from the northeast sector of that community. When you do a downtown plan, everybody comes because there's this shared sense of ownership. That's why, you know, downtowns are so important, and that's why communities have to look at them differently than just another part of the community. And it's also, I don't know if you're real familiar with the term smart growth. You know, how do we grow in a wise way? This is your smartest growth. It's downtown. In other words, the most number of units or square footage of retail or whatever it is served by the least amount of infrastructure in terms of, you know, per linear foot or whatever. It's, you know, the more development you have in your downtown or redevelopment, the less green space you need to eat up. People can walk, they're not, you know, burning up fuel and so forth. So it's definitely the smartest growth. And it's literally your postcard location. I had a really nice welcoming basket that appeared in the hotel. And what was a postcard? Downtown Tryon. So it is quite literally your postcard location. And I noticed in the 2010 strategic plan that the town put together, among the many goals, the very first one up there was increased emphasis on downtown business development based on surveys that they did of citizens. So obviously your downtown is really important. A lot of great progress. You should be very proud of what you've done so far. You know, the group TDDA was organized back in 1994 as just a kind of a group. It wasn't a formal group. Then it became the TDDA back in 97 and got 501c3 status in 2000. And then, you know, the first big project was phase 1 of your Streetscape project. And if you recall, all those overhead lines that you used to have, of course, they went away with that project. And then there was an economic assessment a few years later, and then they started with special events. The iconic clock tower went up in 2005. And then there was a really important study that a lot of my information is from that needs to be updated, of course, in 2008. You became part of the North Carolina Main Street program back in 2009, developed a walking tour brochure the next year, renovated the depot, Beer Fest in 2012. And here's just a list. I'm not going to read all these off because I know you can all read that, especially with a screen this big. It's what a great venue to present in. But anyway, a lot of property improvements have occurred over the years. And by the way, I want to mention on missile dines, what's so important about that one they're all important, but right now you're waiting to see if you can get National Register designation. And I'll talk about the details of that in a few minutes. But that's kind of you're sort of at the fringe on whether you'll meet the requirements. And I think the renovation, which is going to be very accurate historically, will kind of help put you over the edge on that. So that's a really exciting project that's going on now. And special events. And you can see all the past events you've had, and the current ones, the New Year's thing, April Fool, and Beer Fest. Beer Fest is in November, and I may have to come back. I'm a big fan of beer. I just love beer. I never can seem to get enough when I have beer. So, maybe I'll be back. So let's talk now. That's feel good about what you've done so far. Best practices. This is just looking at sort of what's the approach to downtown revitalization? And I like to use the example of a natural ecosystem for what a downtown is. Downtowns are very complex, and there's a lot of issues, and everything's intertwined. So if you tweak something up here, there's kind of a ripple effect. So you have to approach downtowns in a very holistic, a very comprehensive way. And in fact, I wrote a book back in 2009 that the American Planning Association published on downtown planning. And after I did the book, everybody, because it's not exciting. It's not an exciting book. There's a lot of good information, but I always recommend it for people who suffer from insomnia. 2 or 3 pages at bedtime, and you'll be on your way. But to avoid having to read my book, people would come up to me and say, "Phil, what's the silver bullet here?" There is no silver bullet. Think silver buckshot. That's sort of the mantra, silver buckshot, okay? So the Main Street program, as those of you who are involved with TDDA know, they have what they call the 4-point approach. Number 1 is organization, then design, economic restructuring, and promotion. And when I look at a downtown, I tend to think of it in those 4 terms, and I'll go through it. And in fact, when I make the recommendations for your community in a little bit, it'll be kind of organized in that manner. So first of all, the idea of organization, typically, and this is borrowed from Louisiana's Main Street program, this little chart, but it gives you a pretty good idea. Now, what you don't have right now, you don't have an executive director, which I'm going to recommend that you fix that issue. You also don't have an organization committee, which I think is kind of redundant anyway. It's sort of like in Congress, the committee on committees. I don't know that you need an organization committee. So long as you've got somebody looking at promotion, design, and economic restructuring, which you have those committees. So that's but that's a very typical Main Street structure. Let me talk about design now. This is the first of the other 3 points. And design, the term design in Main Street is used very broadly, so even things like land use fall under that. And these are some very basic principles that probably everybody sort of inherently already understands, but just to hit on them, downtowns, they're mixed use, and it's really important that they remain mixed use, that there's a good mixture of different types of uses that keep it active on at least a 16-hour-a-day basis. What you want to do is have your less active uses, things like housing and offices, kind of gravitate up when you can to upper floors. You want to try to keep on most of your ground floor, retail, dining, that sort of thing. In fact, some communities, Pinehurst, North Carolina is an example, where they actually don't even allow, through zoning, ground floor office use. They had all these real estate offices opening up, showcasing all their nice properties there, and they finally put an end to that because they were kind of killing the vitality of the ground floor. So anyway, that's one of the rules. And also mixed use. And when we say mixed use, it's funny, sometimes when I deal with more suburban development, a developer will say, yeah, I'm coming in with a mixed use project. And you look at their plan, And it's not really mixed use, it's multi-use. It's like housing over here and retail way over here and offices here. The great thing about a downtown is that its uses are integrated, not just horizontally, for example, within a single block, a lot of different uses, but vertically, when you have multi-story buildings that have different uses. So that's an important part of downtowns. Anchors, and I want to give you an example. This is years ago, I did a downtown plan for Natchitoches, Louisiana. In Natchitoches, they filmed the movie Steel Magnolias. They've done a lot of movies in Natchitoches. But anyway, so when we made the first trip, we met with the mayor and council. And one of my first questions was there anything on the drawing board in the way of major public facilities that might occur? And they said, oh yeah, we're going to do a new conference center. We said, that's great. Where downtown are you going to put it? Oh no, we're not going to put it downtown. We're going to put it out on the highway. And we all looked at each other like, oh my gosh, the highway, why the highway? Well, the guy who owns the Holiday Inn out there is giving us the land free. It's right next to his hotel. And we said, oh man, we said, don't do that. We said, listen, you're going to start to create another center of gravity economically out there, and it could really help your downtown. They said, well, the thing is, this is a free piece of property. We already got a couple $1 million from the state to do this conference center, and we'd have to go back through the whole approval process, and we can't do that. Well, we kept on them, and to their credit, they decided to go downtown. They reapplied to the state. They got to still keep their couple $1 million of money. They paid $250,000 for a site downtown. They finally built this. It's not the greatest looking building, but it's not bad. And what's really neat is that it became an economic engine. In fact, I was hired to do a downtown retail strategy for them a couple years later just to kind of leverage benefits. So the bottom line there is that these anchors are important. So always remember, whether it's local government offices or whatever that you already have in your downtown, you want to keep them there because they create traffic and people that buy things. So that's important. Also, with regard to urban design, just some kind of basics are ideas like making sure that your streets are lined with buildings, not parking lots. Parking usually gets located behind buildings, and that's the difference between urban development forms and suburban development forms, right? You need to maximize and manage your on-street parking. Manage your on-street parking. We'll get to that later on with the recommendations. And then, with streetscapes, you just want sidewalks that are fairly wide, and you want to attract the storefronts. When they talk about areas that are pedestrian friendly, it's not always about having just the infrastructure of sidewalks. It's also having an interesting walk. Think about when you go to some downtown, some other community, you can walk forever if it's a good experience, if you've got storefronts to look in and so forth. So that's all part of what makes a walkable downtown. I want to give you one example here. This is Northport, Alabama. I did a downtown plan some years ago, and it's right near Tuscaloosa, if you know where that is. And this is the Black Warrior River. So Main Avenue, as they call it, comes down here. It's their key street. It makes a bend here at the riverfront. It used to be a cotton gin right here. So right when we started our project, these developers came out of the woodwork, and they'd already been negotiating with the city. We didn't even know that. And they had their plan for the whole area. They had it all under contract. And so they recognized the need for a parking garage. They were going to line it with ground floor retail, upper floor housing, and that was good. They had a hotel here on a parking lot. They had a hotel here. These are little restaurants, big parking lot, apartments that are organized, of course, around apartments around parking lots. And it's actually a suburban form because so many of the buildings are organized around parking lots as opposed to addressing streets. So they got really nervous when the planning consultants got involved. They told us their development program in terms of square footage, different uses, and they were delighted with the results because we took their plan and just did some tweaks. If you notice, the hotel, instead of being back here, we pulled it to the street. Now you actually started to create a real urban street with the parking back here. Can you imagine ending your key street with a parking lot? We made a little square lined with angled parking all around the perimeter that created nearly as many spaces as their parking lot, plus some underground parking, which they determined later was going to be viable to do. And probably best of all, when you look over here, these apartments or condos that are organized around parking lots, we created an urban street that does this with the parking back here. So again, that may seem like minor stuff to you, but it's really important. It's the difference between suburban development and urban development like a downtown should have. So let's talk about historic buildings. Dealing with your historic buildings should be your top priority over, say, new infill development. And they're really, I hate it when I see good old buildings that get torn down. I mean, sometimes it has to occur because they're too far gone as far as structural stability. But that is your brand. The brand of a downtown is old buildings. And every time you lose one or you have new development that's incompatible, you're starting to dilute that thing that gives you a competitive edge over other commercial mixed-use areas, right? And so it's really important to focus on these buildings. And most communities that really are serious about their downtown historic buildings will adopt historic zoning and some design guidelines. I'll talk about that later. But you also want to have financial incentives, not just sticks, but you want to have carrots too, right? And combine them. I always like to remind my environmentalist friends that the greenest building is the one that's already built. Think about all the embodied energy that an existing building has. By the way, this is a visual simulation. This is in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, where I did a plan years ago for the Douglas block. And this is the existing condition. This is a visual simulation. They've actually completely renovated it. It looks, other than the color of the awnings, it looks almost exactly like this if you were to go to Google Earth or something and look at the Douglas block. But it's just an example of what you can do. Now, let's talk about infill. Like I said before, you want to prioritize existing historic buildings, but when it comes to infill development, it's important that your building relate to the street. This is in Russellville, Arkansas, and it's an existing vacant lot. And some of the things you want to think about are having a fair amount of ground floor transparency. In other words, not solid walls, but window space. You can look in. Think in terms of background buildings like this one that we propose versus foreground buildings. Foreground buildings are those ones that are really special. It might be a civic building that you want to kind of stand out. It might be an important corner location. It could be at a T intersection where it's a visual termination. So those are the things to kind of think about. We actually did a 2-story and a 3-story version, but that's the kind of building that actually fits in with its context. And, to make this stuff happen requires design guidelines. And in fact, someone asked me yesterday, what does that do to property values? That's a great question, actually. And they've done a lot of studies, and never does it negatively impact values. And in most cases, based on their studies, it'll increase it. Although I think oftentimes they happen to designate these districts at the time when they're kind of going upward anyway, and so I don't know about the cause and effect relationship, but the good news is that it seems to not, it certainly doesn't hinder values. But I think these two pictures tell a lot about design guidelines. I mean, these are the same uses, a convenience store. One would fit into a community like yours in your downtown. The other one you probably wouldn't want plopped down right in the middle of your downtown. Another example, and this is totally fair because it's the same company, Walgreens, right? So this one, it might be fine in the suburbs. It sits back. There's a parking lot in front. You've got their very standard, generic design versus a more urban model that fits into a downtown. So, it's important to remember that every time you do development, it's either going to reinforce or it's going to dilute what makes your community unique. Now you're going to wonder, why am I bringing up New York City? Well, there's actually something applicable here. Back in the 70s, New York City started giving density bonuses to developers if they would provide plazas or parks on the ground level. And what they ended up getting were a lot of plazas that weren't being used by people. And so they hired this guy, William White, there he is. He set up all these time-lapse, he set up cameras to do time-lapse photography at all sorts of parks and plazas all over New York City to see how they were used and which ones were more popular. And he came up with a really, really simple list, and here it is, of things that make for great parks. Safe and visible. They're not, they have street frontage. Shade and light, so, depending on the time of year and what's better. Lots of seating, that's important. Both hardscape, paved surfaces, and then green areas. And then a water feature is kind of an added bonus. But the reason that's relevant is because those same principles, it doesn't matter if it's Tryon, North Carolina, or New York City, when it comes to public spaces, those same general ingredients are going to work. And I worked on a project a couple of years ago. It was a citywide plan for Wilson, North Carolina. There's a guy outside of Wilson named Wallace Simpson. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's internationally known for making whirligigs. These are these kind of metal things that have this little fan thingy on it. Really artistic. I mean, in certain art circles, the guy is really well known. So when we did our plan, we decided to put a park here. It was a vacant lot anyway, and it was strategically located for a proposed conference center. These are existing tobacco warehouses that were basically empty, and we were showing some new infill development. There's a site plan version of it. And the great thing about this park is they raised pretty quickly after our plan over $4 million from the National Endowment of the Arts, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, and their state arts council, because we're going to relocate all of Wallace Simpson's whirligigs, or at least some of them from his farm, onto this park, and that's kind of the theme of the park. But it's amazing what's happened. I'm not going to read through that, but as you can see from the quote from the Wilson Times, they've already, as soon as that park was announced, they started seeing a lot more interest in their downtown, and they've had a lot more investment. And that park, I think it's already been installed, but it's at least in the works. So when you do parks, you have to think strategically. How do you locate them where you're going to leverage economic spinoff? Okay, so that's all design. We talked about design. Now the tough stuff, economic restructuring. And, I see a lot of communities that'll do 2 of the 4 steps in particular, maybe 3. They'll organize and have an entity. They'll do design. Streetscape. Why Streetscape? Because it's pretty simple. It's tangible. It's easy to do. They might even do a lot of events for promotion, but the one that they always seem to struggle with is economic restructuring. And it's just a little trickier. It's more complex. But just to give you sort of a taste of what that would entail, is the first step in that is doing market analysis. That's figuring out what types of uses are going to work in your downtown. What kind of retail, how much of it. And this is from High Point, North Carolina, where I worked on a project some years ago. It's for a part of their downtown, Washington Avenue district. And our real estate economist who did the market analysis came up with this as sort of the optimal tenant mix. But it's really important to figure this out if you're going to do downtown planning, because first of all, that informs a plan. It lets you know that if you've got 50,000 square feet of retail, but you've only that can be supported over the next 5 years, but you've only got 10,000 square feet of available building space, then you need 40,000 square feet. It's just like when a developer hires designers, they're given a development program. That's what this is. And it's important that downtowns do that. Also, when you come up with the economic restructuring strategies, financial incentives and that sort of thing, you know what those should be based on this. And when I worked on one of these for Nashville years ago, at the time downtown Nashville had 300 apartments or condos, 300 total housing units. And we did this market analysis that showed there was a built-up demand of thousands of units. There are now thousands of units, and part of the reason is because the city made that report available to developers, and they all started developing a whole lot of housing, and it's totally transformed downtown Nashville. Another part of this, business development. And, the top priority when you do business development is thinking about retention of what you have and expansion of those businesses that can expand in the downtown. Once you've got this optimal tenant mix, you can start pursuing that. However, when it comes to recruitment, because you do want to get new businesses, it's just a matter of figuring out, what is the mix based on your market analysis. Do an inventory of available space so you know where people might go, and then put together a recruitment strategy and some kind of a marketing package. So when you go to those folks you're trying to recruit, you can have some success. Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin did a really interesting thing. They got their four of their local banks, and I realize local banks aren't as common as they used to be, but in Chippewa Falls, they got 4 of them to pool. Each provided $5,000 a year to go into this $20,000 pool. They would have a business plan contest, and the state economic development department would be the judges, kind of the third party outside. And whoever won would get $20,000 as a grant, not a loan, to start their downtown business. Now they had to stay downtown for at least 2 or 3 years, I can't remember. But I thought, what a novel idea. I think more downtowns could look at something like that. And then finally, the last thing under best practices is promotion, the 4th point in the 4-point process. Advertising, joint advertising, where multiple merchants get together and advertise in the paper. Maybe you're using the downtown logo, storefront window displays, cross-marketing. What that means, let's say there's a apparel store and you're showing a sport coat or something like that, and you want to drape it over a chair. Well, get the chair from the furniture store down the street and put a little sign, advertising the furniture store. So there's a lot of creative ways that you can cross-market with storefronts. Brochures, newsletters, the internet, special events, those are all kind of types of promotion. Okay, so that's what you see in other communities as kind of a general rule of thumb. Those are all just kind of broad examples. So this is where the big caveat comes in. I spent about a day before the trip, researching Tryon, and I was given a whole lot of information, probably more than I could really digest. And then, yesterday morning I got started, had a whole bunch of different input sessions. I'd gone on a walking tour before that, and a windshield tour as well, and heard a lot of great ideas. And so that's the caveat. This is not a full-blown master plan like we do for a lot of communities. It's based on 2 days of input and my experience. So here's what I'm recommending. And by the way, if you weren't in one of those groups before, this is very preliminary. And I'm going to have a big Q&A session afterwards. So this is very, it's not finalized by any stretch of the imagination. So at the end of this, I'm going to provide a little report. But anyway, let me run through this. So when it comes to organization, you need to have a manager, somebody who's at least working 20 hours a week. You've got great volunteers. I mean, it's amazing the amount of work that, Wanda and Judd and everybody have put into this stuff. But volunteers will, they've got their own lives to live. They got their own businesses, whatever, their own work. And you need somebody who wakes up, who's actually paid to wake up every morning thinking, how can I improve downtown Tryon? So that's important, to have an actual manager. Now, how would it be funded? Well, you are so fortunate, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Community Foundation, but that is one potential source that we've identified. And so as you know, you're very blessed to have them in your community. And then there's the town government. A lot of cities actually help financially support their downtown group. So those are just a few of the potential sources. This group, the TDDA, will also need to continue to leverage all the other entities that are out there who play a role. I mean, obviously the town's important, especially on infrastructure type of issues. You've got tourism, you've got the chamber, you've got all these different groups, and so they need to partner really well with them. You've got, at one point, I think right now you've got 40 members of TDDA. At one point you had 300. And it's just a matter of TDDA getting aggressive about going out and really trying to recruit people. And again, that whole relationship with the city, you're very fortunate. There are a lot of places I work, and one of them I won't mention, Clarksville, Tennessee. Did I mention that? Anyway, the mayor and the downtown group were like, oh, it was ugly. It was very ugly. A lot of, and you don't have that here, and that's a great thing. But like most communities, I think the town and the downtown group could still, work even more together. I think there's a lot of potential for that. So that's something you need to continue to work on, I think. Let's talk about design. That's the organization part. Design, urban design, mobility, and parking. Right now you've got gaps in your streetscape. You've made really good progress, but there's still some pretty significant gaps that need to be fixed. And what I would do is, I always think a lot of communities are too generous in their streetscaping. And what they need to do before they decide to do a streetscape project is talk to adjacent property owners and say, hey, we're thinking about doing streetscape. What are you willing to do with your property to enhance it? And use the streetscape to kind of leverage some improvements and see if you can get the whole corridor, not just the streetscape, to improve. Now, parking. Right now you don't have a huge parking problem. I mean, some people might think they do. What you really want is a legitimate parking problem. That's your goal, because that means you've got businesses, storefronts filled up, and you've got a lot of people coming. But now's the time to start to really prepare for that success that you want to have. And when you look at it, and these numbers are a little bit old, it might have changed a little bit, but they're a little over 200 on-street spaces, And if you can find any, I didn't have time during my 2 days here, but if there's any place where you can squeeze in more on-street spaces, you need to do that. Including, there's one part of trade where the diagonal parking is on the far side away from the buildings versus the building side. It kind of switches at some point. If there's any way to switch that so you get a little bit more of the parking on the building side, that's worth pursuing. Now that would kind of reconfigure the street just a little bit, and I know it's a state designated road, but that's an idea. Now, here's the biggie. You got to manage your on-street parking. Right now, it's just really not managed. And in fact, the worst thing is when business owners and employees park on the street. I mean, it's just like slicing your own throat. You really need to find off-street spots, which there are at least 120 of. A lot of those, of course, are behind the buildings on Trade and the other parts of downtown. You need to make sure that employees are parking there. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can start off being kind of nice and gentle and kind of ratchet up the aggressiveness as you need to. But a lot of communities really take that real seriously as far as how they manage it. And right now, you're not quite at the point where it's critical, but hopefully it will be critical. With the off-street parking, first of all, people have to know it's there. And so when you start relying more on off-street parking, you're going to want directional signage to guide people there. And also, you may want to look at how to enhance those parking lots. I've seen some really nice-looking parking lots behind buildings with landscaping and well lit at night, which is going to be important so people feel safe. And now here's a tricky one, Palmer Street. Of course, this is Trade. Here's Palmer. And, when I was first looking at the maps before I got here, I looked at it and I said, is this an alley? Because when you look at the depth or lack thereof between the fronts of these buildings, you got the buildings here and then a little bit of parking, it really has the dimensions more of an alley. I mean, a typical rectangle, urban block, you would have, a bunch of buildings over here and parking lots over here, and that's how it would function. There's no way you're going to be able to squeeze in buildings and still retain parking here. So I think the thing to do is you can physically enhance it. I'm not suggesting you downgrade its status from a technical point of view or how it's designed. I think Streetscape would make it a lot better, but it's not a street that you look at that's going to build out with a lot of buildings. You just don't have the space. So it's going to kind of function as an alley. And by the way, one thing that came up about garbage removal that occurs on the Trade Street side now is that you ought to really work towards getting it behind buildings if you can do that. And I know that it may be problematic initially for some businesses, but it ought to be a goal to strive towards. Another thing regarding mobility, your Parks Committee put together a really nice Greenway master plan. And here, following the creek, and this is actually a new one. I think it's a Lanier Park. And it doesn't, Harmon Field is kind of off the map up there, but that would greatly benefit, I think, downtown to try to implement that. It connects to downtown, and that would be a good resource for getting people around. When it comes to buildings, let's talk about buildings. I mentioned a little while ago about the importance of historic buildings and making sure that new buildings are compatible. And you need to continue pursuit of your National Register designation. And, if you're lucky enough to get it, you get one of those nifty little brown signs that goes out on the interstate and at least kind of gets you on people's radar screen a little bit more. I also recommend that you designate a local historic district, and that's very different from National Register. National Register is great because it acknowledges that you've got a nice district and you can be qualified for tax incentives both at the federal level and the state. Actually, the state level went away a while ago, but now it looks like it's going to come back. But it takes a local overlay zone to actually have teeth that would regulate development, how people alter buildings or how new buildings are developed. But I think it's really important to do that if you want to protect the character of your downtown. And when you do that, it requires an ordinance. You would establish a design review body. Sometimes it's called an architectural review board. And so that they're not just arbitrary. This isn't the taste police. You want to avoid that. You want to have very objective design guidelines written so that they can review applications and approve them accordingly instead of just kind of shooting from the hip. and also promoting, it's going to be important to promote the availability of tax credits for historic rehab. And this doesn't appear to be a big issue in your community right now, but a lot of places, I did a plan in Wilkesboro, North Carolina a few years ago. They had a really tough time working with their codes person, especially trying to take upper floor space and convert it for housing. And you're lucky right now, it doesn't sound like you have that, although you're about to get, I think, maybe a new codes person. So that's just something to keep on the radar screen. And this is an example. These are some guidelines I did for Coleman, Alabama a few years ago. But this gives you sort of a sense of the kind of graphics you might find in design guidelines. Things like having a minimum percentage of glazing, that is, window space at the ground floor, things like that. Just some real simple basic standards, buildings that come up to the street, breaking up the massing so that it has that human scale to it that a downtown has. So that's what that might look like. This is interesting. Your 2000 streetscape plan, it looked pretty good in general. There was one thing I saw, though, that dealt with the architecture that I said, oh, don't do this. This is, and they had another photo, it wasn't as good quality, of this building here, and they proposed kind of creating something that never really existed, putting this little parapet thing up there in a big cornice. And I realized it might kind of look nice, but you want to try to be authentic to your original buildings and not create something that didn't really exist. So that's one of those things you probably don't want to do. And let me give you, there are a lot of examples in town. One of the things you have a lot of that you probably want to see if you can replace with something more historically accurate, and that is these kind of sheds that have the asphalt shingle, that a lot of buildings have. That's something to look at and seeing if you can replace. But I didn't want to step on a bunch of toes here, so I thought, let's get something from out of town. So this is Russellville, Arkansas. Me smart. This is an existing building in Russellville, and this is what we proposed with a visual simulation. It was so easy to do this because we had a historic building, a historic photo of this building, and it's really easier to look at this to picture, here's what it looked like originally, and here's how they screwed it up, right? But we've seen this so much in different towns. They took this great clip corner and they built stuff out here, and the way they treated the ground floor separate from here, and they did a different paint scheme. Now these awnings look kind of nice, but they're really 1950s metal awnings that are starting to rust and stuff. If you're up close, you'd be able to see that. And so here's what we ended up with. But one of the questions that was posed to me yesterday was, what do you do with these buildings that are just sitting there vacant and the owner doesn't appear to be really trying to market them at all? And that's tough. That's a really tough, because you can't make somebody do something with their property. However, if the building starts to fall into some kind of a code issue, disrepair, the city can kind of, or the town can kind of look at that idea, maybe apply a little bit of pressure on the owner. So that's one thing you can do. But instead of looking at Arkansas, why don't we look right here? Talk about a great project. Yeah, Scott's project is wonderful. And I said, who did the architecture? He told me he was a local architect. I'm like, wow, you're really blessed to have, good architects in town. So this is the way to do it, to bring it back. I mean, that's historically more, in line with what it would have looked like. You can see some of the, and by the way, that's the kind of awning I was talking, or canopy that, doesn't really work. Okay, what about new buildings? I just grabbed some photos of, these are all new buildings, or at least at the time I took the photos, they were new buildings, just to give you a sense that, yes, you can actually create new buildings the way they used to. And, this is like a clapboard. It's as opposed to brick like the other ones. This is actually in Nashville. This is in outside of Charlotte. This is Vermilion. I don't know if you've ever heard of Vermilion. It's a traditional neighborhood development outside of, it's either in Huntersville or, what's the neighboring, Connorsville? I don't, one of those towns. But anyway, it's a great development. That's a neat building. You can tell by the balcony that it's not really historic, but it's a kind of building, infill building I think would work well here. Okay, so that's all the fun stuff, pictures and design and everything. Let's get to the tough stuff, and that is economic restructuring. So, we had to, right now we're having to rely on your study that was done back in 2008. And at the time, we've actually adjusted the numbers. There were something like 25 retail businesses. We think there are about 20 now. According to that study at the time, there was demand for about 50,000 additional square feet of retail space. I don't know what it is now, but at the time. So it also identified 3 key markets for retail in downtown Tryon. So you got local residents, and you've got over 12,000 people within a 5-mile radius. You've got downtown employees, over 700 or so. And in fact, White Oak is going to probably be adding more to that, I think. And then finally, you got tourists and visitors. Now, the county ranked really low statewide back in 2006, but at the time, the trend was increasing, so that's the good news. But if you look at the tourist visitor market, there's kind of some sub-markets or niches that you might look at. And one is obviously equestrian. You know that well. That's a well-established sub-market for you to figure out how to leverage for your downtown. Arts and crafts, and not only are there a lot of art galleries and things, but the crafts part, you got a tradition of that. Think about back when they did the toy making and so forth. So that's really neat. I was blown away by the number of antique shops, not so much in the downtown core, but peripheral. There's a critical mass of antique shops, and you can lure a lot of antiquers, especially if that's promoted aggressively. And then finally, this fourth kind of emerging or potential one would be cyclists. So those are just some of the groups to kind of look towards to market. Now, I don't expect you can actually read this. Well, maybe if you're up close. I didn't expect you to be able to read it. I didn't know how to have a screen this big, but I'm going to spare you all the details. But this is from that 2008 study that the state did looking at potentially viable businesses in downtown Tryon based on square footage. And here's kind of a bullet point list of what came out of that based on my observations, also based somewhat anecdotally on what people have said to me that I think, okay, that might be viable. And again, you really want to do market analysis. So I'm calling this a guesstimate, okay, with a giant asterisk by it. So electronics and appliance stores, clothing, full-service restaurants, and that's the thing about downtowns. Even yours has now become more of an entertainment specialty retail. It's not, you don't get everyday goods and services other than maybe the hardware store. And that's just kind of what happens nowadays. Now that we have big boxes out at interstates, that's what happens with downtowns. They kind of evolve into something different. Office supplies, stationery, and then something for families. And those were some of the things that have kind of come up as potential new uses or expanding existing uses. So the approach, as I mentioned before, and I hate to sound like a broken record, coming up with the optimal tenant mix through market analysis. If you can't afford to do a full-blown analysis, maybe relying on the state Main Street program to kind of update the numbers they did come up with, which are not going to be as specific or as targeted. And you need to put together a business recruitment team. This is something that TDDA would do. If you can hire a director, that person would be key. You'd want at least one member of the Economic Restructuring Committee, and then someone who's an actual business owner that can say, yes, this is what it's like to operate a business in downtown Tryon. And you want to arm them with, a recruitment package. And really what tends to work best is, you're not going to lure chains. In fact, you don't want chains, but you don't meet the numbers that they would require anyway. And the best strategy is to look at successful businesses. Let's say it's a Mexican restaurant and it's in Landrum or it's somewhere else. And maybe they're interested in opening a second restaurant or a third restaurant, something like that. Those are your best candidates usually, is finding something already in the region that's owned, kind of a mom and pop type business that might be willing to expand in your downtown. And then the last idea, I think, on economic restructuring, or at least on retail, is to think like a suburban shopping mall. Not that you want to duplicate a suburban shopping mall, but when tenants sign for space in a mall, they also agree to all sorts of things: common area maintenance fees, CAM fees. They agree to consistent days and hours of operation. All those things that an independent downtown person, you can't force them to do, obviously, but you need to try to corral them and get folks on the same page to the extent that you can. So when it comes to looking at days and hours of operation, you ought to at least explore Sundays. Now, I totally understand and respect that some people don't want to be open on Sunday, and it can be religious reasons or whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But you want to look and see if some people might be willing to. A lot of people like to take one day off. I hear in Tryon, Monday's not the day to do it. Maybe it's Tuesday, maybe it's Wednesday, and it probably really from January to March, trying to be open on Sundays isn't going to probably get you real far anyway. But also looking at evenings, and instead of trying to be open late every evening, which most people probably can't do, is to try to figure out, maybe it's one Thursday night a month, and you tie it to an event at the theater. But what you have to do, you have to sustain it. You have to pick what night are we going to be open later. Everybody's got to be on board, and you got to keep doing it for at least 6 months, because that's how long it's going to take the market to really understand that, oh yeah, the Downtown Tryon stays open late on Thursday nights. But again, tie it to something like an event at the theater. So what about other uses? Well, when it comes to office uses, we think there are about 40 offices right now, and as I mentioned before, it's great. I mean, not that you want to look a gift horse in the mouth when you've got office space that's there, I mean, that's being rented, but you want it to, over time, kind of gravitate upward or to side streets. Same thing with housing, and you know, the thing about having residents downtown, right now you have very few residents, as you know. What's important isn't just the market support that they lend, the fact that they can go out and buy things and dine in the restaurants, that's good, but what's even more important is that downtown residents make the place feel alive, particularly at night, and that really has probably more value than just simply their purchasing power. Now, linking some of these uses to space, you know, you need to make sure you have a good handle on, and if you can get a director, they'll be able to maintain an inventory of available space. You know, some of the key ones are, you know, the Missildine property, South Trade Building, Bank of America. There are lots and lots of others, but those are just some of them. And when it comes to new infill development, once you're doing well with all your existing space, there are a lot of different locations potentially where you could get new development. Now, most of them, like here and here, are parking lots. So I recognize that you'd have to figure out the parking situation if you're going to develop some of these vacant lots. And I'll come back to this in a second, the town's public works yard. But those are just some examples of places where it could happen. So on the public works yard, you know, here's Maple and Palmer right here. And there's a creek, by the way, that runs through here. And, you know, this is a prime redevelopment site. The town owns it. It is on the market. I think key potential uses would be a hotel or high-density housing, although I will tell you, with regard to a hotel, the tricky thing in this area, as many of you probably know, is that while you might be able to, you know, lease up a hotel on weekends, it's tough during the week. There's not a whole lot of business travel here. So that, but anyway, that would be a location, if not for hotels, certainly for higher density housing like townhouses or something like that. Now, it does need to have an environmental assessment conducted, because there have been all sorts of interesting things that have been there over the years. So that's one issue. Here's another one, though, potentially, and this is completely up to the owner if they had interest sometime in the future, but the dealership that Stott's Ford occupies, it's not on the market, by the way, as you probably know. I think it, too, could be a good site for either a hotel, high-density housing, you know, some ground floor retail. It would be a wonderful anchor on the north end of downtown. However, you're really, really lucky to have, you know, the tax revenue, the jobs they create, all that kind of stuff. So we're not saying by any means run them off their site. What we're just saying is they may decide at some point that this has a lot of value for redevelopment, and maybe they would find another site that could serve their purposes, but you definitely want to keep them in town, no doubt about that. But that's another potential site. How about incentives? Well, you know, already we have state and federal level incentives, and those need to be promoted, you know, particularly if you get National Register designation, that would be useful. Locally, and I don't know if this is a dormant incentive or if it still is active, but I know the city did have a program for, it's a matching grant, 50% match for historic building rehabilitations, but the cap is $1,000. And you know, that it might be great for sort of aesthetic things, painting and so forth, but it's not going to trigger a major project. So, you know, kind of looking at something that's a little more robust as an incentive. You know, one thing, and I can't remember what the law is in North Carolina. I think this is viable, but if not, I remember there are ways kind of around it to achieve the same purpose. But a property tax abatement is a situation where you take a property that's about to be improved, whether it's an existing building rehab or new development, and you freeze the assessed value. And you know, maybe it's 5 years, and that way you're not penalizing somebody who invests in their property and watches their assessed rate and their taxes go up. And so that's one type of incentive you might look at. But you want to tie that, you would obviously have really clear guidelines on how you use it and tie it maybe to housing or lodging, kind of a moderate to high-end lodging, which would have to be well-defined. Promotion, and by the way, we're about to wrap up. We're almost there, so I appreciate your patience. Creating, a logo is really important. All the downtown businesses could use that. You got to have Morris in there. There's no way around that, I don't think, having a logo without Morris. The TDDA, it has a website. I think it needs to just kind of get more traffic and visibility and so forth, but it should utilize social media as well. I think the events that you do are great, and you need to keep doing that, and also keep looking for new ones to do. Now, I would emphasize quality over quantity, but there may be some other events that you could start and look to other groups to sponsor those and do more of the heavy lifting. I talked about joint advertising before, but that's something that TDDA can coordinate. And with this history, I just found this on the internet. I thought, wow, somehow they can play off that, right? I mean, with all your interesting folks who've been here over the years, I think you could really use that with your advertising. So, what are the next steps? You've heard a lot of ideas. The key things to kind of leave you with are, first of all, I think it's really important that you hire a Main Street manager, a director, whether they're full-time or part-time. But again, volunteers can only take you so far because they've got their own life to live. So there has to be somebody who's paid to actually do this stuff. And you need to do a downtown plan. Now, I always feel a little awkward as someone who does downtown plans for a living. It's kind of like a car salesman going, you need a car. I always feel a little awkward saying that, but I really think you need a plan. I guess the reason it's not totally self-serving is because there actually are other people besides me that do those kind of plans. Some of them are even pretty good. So, but I think it's important. Some. Yeah. You can only compliment your competitors so much. But but I think it's important to have a plan, and it's much more than, don't confuse this 2-day stay of mine in a bunch of ideas on the PowerPoint as a plan. A plan is much, much more detailed. What's important about a good plan is that you have public engagement. And I have a process, and a lot of other people use the same kind of process, where you do a charrette, this week-long brainstorming thing, and usually on the front end there's a public workshop, and you get as many people, citizens, as you can, and you break them up into teams. You sort of deputize them for the night to be planners. And they all have big base maps of the study area, and they have different colored markers. And you walk them through a process where they come up with their own plan. And at the end of the night, they present their plan, and everybody applauds. And there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy. And what happens is people, kind of start to see their thumbprint on the plan. They have a sense of ownership. And when the community has a sense of ownership, then that's how plans get implemented, because you'll attend the town meeting where the town council is going to vote on some particular issue that's a new project for downtown, and you become the squeaky wheel that makes it happen. So that's why when people say, well, we've heard folks come into town, we've seen plans, and they never amounted to anything. Well, they didn't do the right process, and that includes meaningful hands-on engagement of stakeholders. And that's how, when I look at the communities where I've done plans and I look at their success, that's usually what, in addition to the fact that it's got to be a realistic plan, it's got to be grounded in economic reality, which is why I always use a real estate economist. But I think the main thing is the process, okay? And just making sure that the public's involved. The other thing I would mention to you, until you get your manager, which we hope you get, and maybe a plan, I would hold off to the extent that you can on making major decisions that might involve land use, properties, and that sort of thing. So, just to close out, this may be a little bit strong, but everywhere I go, it seems like people are always kind of bickering. I mean, Clarksville, Tennessee, the town I'm not going to mention, it seemed like nothing would happen there because somebody ticked off somebody back in high school and held a grudge, and so nothing would happen. So don't be like that community. Just, everybody needs to get on the same page. Everybody needs to get involved. And a lot of it's about attitude, just having a positive attitude and saying, we're gonna do this. We're going to transform this downtown and making it happen.